The first characteristic that's easy to see in a dip pen nib is the range. That's the easiest thing to measure, how thin it is and how thick it can be. And there are pens that go from 0 to 10. There are pens that go, well, not from 0 to 10, but you know what I mean, is approaching 0 to approaching 10. 10 would be the widest line that the pen can make. And I imagine we can imagine a pen that can make a line that's many feet in diameter, but or in width. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about within reason. So 0 to 10 is our range. 0 to 10, and this pen, the fine seems to be skipping a little bit here. The fine doesn't seem to be very fine. The unpressured downstroke. Here the weight of the pen is making the line. I'm not even pressing down on it, and so I would call that relatively medium. The thick is certainly fatter than the thin, but nothing to write home about. It's rather common, this particular nib. So let me write a line with it again, showing you the range. So it goes from thin to that thick. Let's pick a different one that has the fine is a little finer than that, but the thick is greater. So the range is much greater. From the thin to the thick is almost half again as much as that other one that I showed you. So this one I would say is more flexible, of course. Let's just part of the reason that's skipping is because my hands have been all over this paper here. See what happens when I put my fingerprint on that page. The oils of my hand will, oils of the skin will resist the ink, where if I don't touch it, we don't have that problem. But again, my fingerprint immediately makes it skip. So here is a nib that's more flexible than that first one I showed you. Thin to thick. Thin to thick. But watch this one. This is another dip pen nib. These are all from the 1880s and 1890s. Here's the thin is not that thin, I guess. But watch the thick. The thick is extremely wide, and the ink output is great. Let's see if I can show you the puddle of ink that's on it. I guess my light source isn't allowing me to do that, but so again, a huge range, but the fine is a little less fine than I like. I like the nibs that are closer to 0 at the start. The ones that sort of start at 1 seem to me less interesting to write with than the ones that are start out their life start out their line as a very fine point. Let's see what this one does. Now this one, getting dizzy here, I'm sure. Shoot. This one starts out finer, but it's pretty flexible, so you do get a nice range. So again, the range is, think of from 0 to 10. The finer the point, the closer to 0, the fatter the line, closer to the 10. So our ideal pen could go from 0 to 10. The real pen is close to 0 and close to 10, but you can never get an invisible line, clearly. Well, you can if you don't make a line, but the line, if it is to be a line, has to have some width. This isn't Euclid. We're talking about the real world. So, again, the easiest thing to describe in a fountain pen is clearly the range. You can measure it with a ruler or a micrometer, thin to thick. Very, very, very easy thing to understand and to actually measure. Just amazing. I'm pressing down with these pens all sort of with the same amount of pressure, and you see it's clearly how different they are. This one is about a quarter of the ability of that pen, and so if this was 0 to 10, this is 0 to 3. Let's see what this one is. Where's my... This is maybe 0 to 5. It's better than 5, but we'll call it 5. So anyway, the range, that's the easiest range. That's the easiest characteristic to quantify. Back with more characteristics in a moment. The next character aspect of a nib I want to describe is what I call the return. And it is the speed at which you go from the shaded downstroke to the fine upstroke. And fountain pens, flexible fountain pens, even the most flexible fountain pen has a slow, sluggish return where somehow ink continues to be laid on thick even when you lift up on the pen. And it's hard to see perhaps here, but I can maybe see if I can take a picture of it where I describe it, where the picture can describe it better than I can here. But so here's a Waterman nib from the 30s, 40s era. Flexible, perfectly good pen to write and draw with, but I would call this a sluggish return. Here's the fine line it can make, and the thick line it can make. But when you go from thick to thin, it just doesn't get thin fast enough. It should get thin immediately on your release of pressure. You go upstroke. I want this to be immediately thin. So let's see how a Victorian era pen does that. So here we have our thick, and look at immediately it's the return goes from 0 to 60 fast. You want it to go from 60 to 0 fast too. Nice snappy return to thin from the thick. The shaded thick to the thin, and it happens immediately. And that's what I love about the snappiness of these Victorian era nibs. And I don't know, I believe it's not so much that they close up faster, but there's something about the shape of the iridium that allows them to just immediately snap back to 0 without having the residual ink on that iridium ball. Even the finest, most flexible fountain pen nibs don't have that quality. Very few of them have that quality, I should say. There's a couple that I have that are quite fast at that return. But it's the return, the fast return, that is pretty rare on fountain pen nibs. But it's almost always present with the Victorian dip pen nibs. It's just something that they do that other nibs can't. So return. Let me grab another very moppy pen and see if that return is as good as this one. See, pretty quick. Pretty quick there. It's hard to draw to show you what I'm doing here because the camera is in between me and the page, so it's hard for me to see what I'm doing. All right, let me try a really sloppy nib and see how its return is. Even here it's good. Goes from fat to thin immediately. The angle I'm holding this pen so I can take a picture of it with my camera is causing the feed to hit the paper. So again, the thick to thin. God bless. Where is... Here we go. See? Thick to thin, immediately. Immediately. That is perfect. Just does it right away. That is a wet noodle nib, which I'll describe in a little bit. Again, when I'm writing normally, you don't have the feed hitting it. Or you don't have that either. Snagging the pen. It's really hard to write when the camera is in your face here. Great return. So, the return. T-U-R-N. So we have range. We talked about the range. We've talked about the return. And what's next? What is next? Question mark. Well, what's next is more subjective. It's not something you can measure. It's more of a feeling you get when you write with the pens. But I'll do my best to describe what I feel is what you need, what you might want to consider when you're looking at pens to write with. And one is snappiness. One is wet noodleness. One is greeting the page, which is, I don't know how I'm going to describe that one, but I'll try to come up with some way to do it. Anyway, range and return. There you go. The next characteristics I'm going to just call snappy. It's sort of like a return. It has to do with the pen's sort of tug of war with you. Sort of the opposite of a tug of war, though. You're pushing down and it's pushing back. Tug of wars are you're both pulling apart. But think of think of maybe arm wrestling. You're pushing one way and your opponent is pushing back. The pen is doing the same thing with you. And I like pens that have a strong resistance. And I guess it isn't quite the right word, isn't snappy. Maybe resistance is the word. Let's change our term. Resistance. So we had range and we had return and now we have resistance. It's the pushback. And the more the pen pushes back, I think the more control you will eventually have over it. Because you really have to pay attention to what you're doing. If a pen does not offer resistance, and it just gives in, you have to be much more careful about how you make the line. You have to be much more mindful. So resistance is a good thing, I think. And you can have a pen that goes from 0 to 10 and have lots of resistance, or you can have it go from 0 to 10 and have no resistance. And this is what people call the wet noodle pen, is the no resistance. They just give in immediately. And though you might think that that's a valuable asset, it really isn't, because it just makes it much harder to use. So again, I prefer pens that make me do some work and always are letting me know that they're pushing back. I'm pushing down, they push back. And though I may win, the battle is fun because we're talking, the pen and I. We're having a little conversation. And that's the fun part. The more resistance the pen gives you, the more work you have to put out. And if you're able to be mindful of your pressure that you apply, and you're able to apply pressure 1, you can write, without any variation at all. If you're applying more pressure, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but the more resistance you get from a pen nib, the better control I believe you have over it. You need to show who's boss, but you want to show who's boss to someone who fights back. You need that play between you and the pen. Now, a wet noodle nib is one that can get really, really thick immediately, but if I wanted to have something in the middle, it's hard for me to keep it in the middle because it's going to want to give in, and I have to be very mindful of having it work in something other than full 100 miles an hour on the highway. It doesn't allow me to go 30, whereas a pen that has that same range but some pushback, I'm able to drive at 30 miles an hour. I don't have to drive only at 60. So even though this one can go to 60, I'm able to stay on the side streets perfectly fine and have my 30 mile an hour speed limit respected. And consequently, this sort of a pen nib allows me to do so much more than the really sloppy, wet noodly nib, which really only wants to go on the Autobahn in Germany at 190 miles an hour. And I guess there's value in that, but I think it's more interesting to, again, have that resistance, which allows you to do more things, and I think actually allows you to have more fun, more pleasurable experience actually writing, because you're doing more work. So anyway, we have range, return, and resistance. And I'll try to come up with another R word that can describe the other quality that I'm going to try to describe to you. Resistance, I think, can be measured as well. You can probably put this pen nib on some sort of a scale, and it will be easy to measure how much pressure is required to make it give you a fat line. This would be something easily measurable. So, next characteristic will be next. I have to come up, go to my thesaurus and find an R word to describe what the heck I want to describe. Very subjective, though, as we move further and further away from range and return and resistance. Hello. The aspect I'm going to talk about now is going to be a little bit more subjective than what we've talked about so far. And for lack of a better term, I'm going to call this timbre. And I have an R word for it in just a moment, but I'm going to talk about sort of the quality of the noise. Now, you know when you're listening to a musical instrument that even if the instrument is playing the same note, you know that this middle C is played by a bassoon versus a clarinet or a piano or a guitar because of the timbre, I think. Someone will correct me, but I think that that is really the quality of the sound. And with a fountain pen and its sound, it's dependent on the paper you're writing on. So of course a rougher paper is going to have a different sound than a smooth piece of paper, but each nib, given the same piece of paper, is going to write differently and make a different sound, and its timbre will be different. And the word I'm going to use, the R word, is resonance. So I don't know if I'm spelling it correctly here, but resonance. The sound of the nib against the paper. So just listen. I'll shut up for a second here. So that's how that one sounds. Let's try this nib. See if this one sounds any different. You can tell the different sound here. This sounds smoother, and in fact it is. And smoothness is a quality that you might like or not, but I find the feedback of a nib that is slightly scratchy is one that actually gives me better understanding of how I'm writing, and it gives me better feedback, and I can control it better because of the sound. The sound actually helps. It's like the sound that a car makes as you're going from one gear to the other. The sound helps you decide when you need to shift the gears. Your foot pedal doesn't understand it, but it's the sound that does. So here, the sound of a pen going across the page, the resonance is a quality that each nib has, and each nib has a different resonance than another. And it might be smooth and soft, it might be sort of prickly and scratchy, but each one of those sounds you hear is going to change how you write, how you move across the paper, how you glide across the paper. It might even change the word you might choose. You might say, you might be writing along, and if you're using this pen, you'll use the word, I don't know, what word do you use? It may just change the way you think about what you're writing based on the sound you're hearing, the timbre, the resonance, and it's going to be just a different way of understanding how a nib is different from another nib. The range, the return, the snappiness, or the, what was the word I used? The other R word, responsiveness. And now it's the resonance. And again, it's the relationship of the pen to the paper. And smoothness is the simple way to describe it. A pen is either smooth or scratchy. Well, it's everything in between those two words. And learning or appreciating, whether you learn anything or not is maybe not as important as appreciating it, is listening to it, and I think it does determine so much about how you write a word is the sound that the pen makes as you're writing it. So listen to that pen, and then listen to this one. Now, I must also confess there's all sorts of other things that are changing the way a pen might sound or look. The one I just showed you, wrote with, does have a metal barrel and a metal cap, and maybe there's a different vibration that is set up between the vibrations that the nib makes as it goes across the paper and the material that the pen barrel is made of. But I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about the sound of the nib against the paper, the timbre, the resonance. And there are certain pens that you're going to have that are going to sound like Ethel Merman with her vibrato. There's another one that will sound like Bing Crosby with his crooning voice. There's another one that will sound maybe shrill. And they still may make the same line, but a shrill voice will make it shrilly, and a melodious voice will make it melodiously. That's the word. So, resonance, return, range, responsiveness, and resonance. And there's probably a way of measuring this too, and it might be a scratchometer can measure the vibrations of the pen as it goes across any given surface. But we're sort of moving away from something that's as factual as something is more sort of subjective or personal to someone's tastes. And soon this piece of paper is going to be covered in blue ink. So I'm just going to show you different pens and just have you listen to them. Try to listen to them rather than watch the lines they make. Listen to the nib on the paper. I'll get the pens ready in just a moment. Here we're again talking about the resonance of the paper, pen against the paper. Not very noisy, but let's try this one. This is quieter than the one that I just showed you. Seems very smooth on the paper. Now let's try this one. I hear that sound, it seems deeper. Now again, this might be who knows what is causing it. It might be the length of the nib as it's outside of the holder. It might be the shape of the iridium. It almost seems lower, slightly raspy, but a little lower. Higher in tone. Now, of course, each of these pens will, to my fingers, feel smoother or less smooth. try this one. Very, very different feel. Each one of these feels different and it sounds different. And of course the line it makes is different. But just very different sound. And so many different ways to enjoy a pen. You know, what it looks like in your hand or in your pocket is just, you know, the least important factor in my mind. But some pens will be much more fun more pleasurable to write with than others, probably based on that scratchiness and smoothness aspect of it. But there's something else that sort of this leads to, not just the noise that the pen makes, but it's a term that some friends of mine and I have developed called greeting the page, and it's how the pen feels as it's going across the page. Sometimes the pen is resistant and is a little bit behind you, and sometimes it's ahead of you. It's sort of slippery, and it sort of understands where you're going. And I don't know what word starts with an R that can describe that, but it's the way the pen travels across the page. It can be ahead of you, it can be behind you, it can be fighting you, it can be guiding you along. It can be almost helping you make the letters. It's like it knows what word you're spelling. Other times, you know, a pen nib may feel hesitant, pulling a little timid, let's say. And I think this is very closely related to the sound it's making. It's aural, A-U-R-A-L, feedback that it's giving you, I think, is a very important quality of pen use, pen writing, is hearing that noise that it makes, feeling that resistance against the paper. You know, a completely quiet pen, one that's infinitely smooth and you're writing on infinitely smooth paper, you won't be able to control it. It'll just slide all over the place. It'll have no resistance whatsoever. So resistance in the sense of, not in the sense of the springiness of the nib, that's a certain kind of resistance. This is more, again, about the vibration, the texture of the paper, and the nib going across it. So again, I'm calling that resonance. There you go.